Welcome back for our second to last session. But this is going to be a good one. You all are in for a treat. So welcome, come on in. We are getting into a conversation on just like what we wrapped up on DEI is everybody's job. And I'm excited for you to hear from Andrea G. Tatum. Her pronouns are she, her, hers, and she's the founder of AGT Diversity Consultants. In addition to that, she also brings her expertise in terms of her 9 to 5 as well. Let her share a little bit more about that if she'd like to. But we're excited to have you. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. So I think you were sharing, we were seeing your slides.
Oh, yes. Okay, hold on one second. Let me share again.
Awesome.
All right, are you seeing everybody's job as DEI now?
Yes, we're seeing it. It looks great, and feel free whenever you're ready to take it away.
Awesome, thank you. Well, first of all, thank you for that awesome introduction. So yes, by day, I am the Senior Director of Corporate Engagement at an organization called Catalyst, where we help to create inclusive workplaces specifically for women. And every other minute of the day, I am the CEO of AGT Diversity Consulting. And I'm so excited to be here with you all today. I know it's the end of the day and you all have had some awesome speakers that you all have already heard from. And you are probably looking at the title of this and thinking like, okay, how is DEI everybody's job? So let me just start, kind of by telling a little bit about my story and how I ended up in the roles that I am in today. So I actually started my career in nonprofit arts organizations doing marketing. The first job that I had outside of college was actually working for the Tennessee Performing Arts Center. And my job was to get butts into seats, place ads, do PR, sell tickets, and that was it. But for me, it wasn't quite enough. I knew that there was more that I could do. And so if you know anything about the arts, they have historically been quite elitist. And that, the average audience member was over the age of 50 and white. We often refer to our audience as the blue hairs because everyone had the blue hair. And so there wasn't just a lack of diversity in the audience, but often in the admin offices and even with what was going on the stage. And so even though I was early in my career, I knew that I had the ability to make an impact and have influence from what I was doing. I could be intentional about where I placed ads. I could be intentional about the images that I used in the advertising. I started using social media, that tells you all how old I am, to actually, because I was like right at the forefront of when social media was becoming a thing. And I was thinking I could use that to actually target college students. And I was able to help develop young professional events and get younger people into the audiences. I then ended up moving to Atlanta and working for the Alliance Theater there. And I was actually recognized as one of the most influential women in Atlanta, specifically for the work that I was doing around helping to diversify the audiences at that theater. And eventually I landed in San Francisco, which is where I live now. And I went to work for the San Francisco Symphony. Different places, same problems in the arts. And again, my job was just to get the butts into the seats. But I had at this point began to mature in my career and was becoming more vocal about not just the makeup of the audience, but also the representation on the stage. And I would have conversations with the leaders about, what were we producing? What did that diversity even look like? Now, by no means am I saying that I single-handedly solved the problem of diversity and inclusion in the arts, but I am saying that I was able to utilize my voice and be a part of the solution. And I was really fortunate that I had leadership that was making space for me to have that voice, that empowered me to make those changes to what's considered kind of the status quo. After 10 years of working in the arts, I decided to pivot my career into tech and began working as a product marketer and specialized in customer events. So in that role, my job was to get our current and new customers to upgrade, our technology, to buy the technology. And I loved it. But again, I saw that there was opportunity and that I could have an influence in my role. Now, admittedly, it did mean that I was taking on some additional responsibilities and having to do work off of the side of my desk, and I wasn't always compensated for it. But what was happening is I was actually gaining exposure to my leadership. And so the CTO and the CMO of my company were seeing what the work that I was doing, and they became my sponsors. They became champions for me, and I wouldn't even know it, but they were speaking my name when I wasn't even in the room. So when I decided that I wanted a full-time career in diversity, equity, and inclusion, they were the first ones to say, yes, like the work she's been doing is amazing. Let's get her in there. And so when I got into the role, I knew that the initiative-based, kind of marketing-driven approach that I was doing at first around DEI, because that's the sphere of influence that I had, it wasn't enough. So when I came into a leadership role within DEI at a company called Tableau, which eventually got purchased by Salesforce, I was able to start looking at it from a more strategic lens and thinking about what were all of the things that needed to be impacted in order to see real change within the organization. And so I was able to, start bringing together all of those disparate DEI efforts and create a strategy. So looking at how do you recruit talent from underrepresented groups, and how do you build a more inclusive company culture where everyone feels this sense of belonging. So you're like, okay, why are you telling us your entire life story? It's in order to illustrate that even though for most of my career, I didn't have this title of D&I, I still was able to use my sphere of influence to have an impact. Oftentimes people see the words diversity, equity, and inclusion. They go, well, that's the job of the CDO or your head of diversity, maybe your head of HR, or maybe your CEO. And in reality, like it takes all of us, like everybody has to kind of be a part of this solution. Everybody has to take responsibility and make DEI a part of their job. Now, let me be 100% clear in saying that the burden of change cannot rest solely on the shoulders of people from marginalized groups, but we do have an opportunity to be active participants. And I'm not telling you that everybody has to go and take on a whole new workload, but I'm saying shift your mindset from thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion as just this siloed thing that sits over in HR, and think about actually how you can do your job with the lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion. You can have an impact just by being an inclusive marketer. You can have an impact by ensuring, if you're a product developer, that you're creating a product with a diverse set of customers in mind. Even if you're in finance, you can think about, how do you work with supplier diversity, and thinking about pushing that and saying like, we should get more people and utilize more companies that are Black owned or whatever it may be. That's how you use your sphere of influence. But let's take a click down and think specifically about DEI when it comes to advancing Black professionals in the workplace. And as I said, D&I or DEI has become so trendy, even though, as I heard Brittany saying earlier, like this work has been around for a long time, but it's really coming to the forefront. And oftentimes, I think in saying DEI, even what those words actually mean get lost. And people kind of forget that there's a human element behind the words diversity, inclusion, and equity. All of them have something really specific that they mean to each one of them. So let's just for a moment talk about exactly what I mean when I say that. Because it's really easy that when you think about diversity, most people, yes, you think about race, and that's the first thing that comes to mind. But even as a Black community, we have to remember that there's diversity within our own community because we are not a monolith. We have to acknowledge all of the varying identities of each person, right? And so back in 1989, Kimberly Crenshaw coined this term around intersectionality. And what it really does when you talk about intersectionality is you're exploring all of the social identities. So that's race, class, your gender identity, and sexual orientation, how all of those aspects overlap with one another and how those systems of power can oppress some people and advantage other people in both the workplace and in a broader sense. So then when I talk about equity, really, I think about making sure that all of those people, regardless of how they identify, have access to what they need in order to be successful. And I always like to reiterate that equality and equity are not the same thing. Equality assumes that everybody is already playing on a level playing field, but we all know that that is not the case. And then lastly, there's inclusion, right? And so when I think about inclusion, how do you get all of these people within that organization, regardless of how they identify, to feel respected? How do they feel valued? Do they feel like they belong and have the ability to bring the version of themselves to work that they want to bring? Do they have that psychological safety and they don't have to cover? When I talk about covering, it means having to like hide certain aspects of who you are, like perhaps having to straighten your natural hair or something to that effect. And so if your company is lucky enough to have a head of D&I, they're really there to help develop this roadmap, to think about the goals and the strategy at a high level. And I loved Ashley's presentation this morning where she showcased Caterpillar's roadmap. It was so awesome. And I love when I see leaders thinking so strategically. But it ultimately boils down to three main things. People are focused on recruiting, retaining, and developing talent. And it seems easy enough because that's it. But let me tell you, it is not quick and it is not easy because even these best laid strategies, they face multiple roadblocks when they're trying to come to fruition. Roadblocks like racism, sexism, white supremacy, a lack of budget, ableism, tokenism, homophobia, and fear of change, just to name a few. And we also know that what's going on in the world and current affairs can also have an impact. So again, it's not enough to just assume that your CDO is going to be able to do every little thing when it comes to this strategy. And that is why I say it is everybody's job, not just one person. So let's talk about it. What are some things that you can do to affect change within your organization, regardless of the level you're at? And how can we help to continue to advance Black professionals in the workplace? So I'm going to start with leaders because I know we've got some leaders here. When I mean leaders, I'm talking about your executives, your decision makers. What kind of culture are you building in your organization? You set the tone ultimately. You have the ability to say what kind of culture you want to have in your organization. And I love this. Many of you may have seen this, but when President Biden came into office, he right away set the tone and he said, if you ever are working with me and I hear you treat another colleague with disrespect or talk down to someone, I promise you, I will fire you on the spot. He said, on the spot. And I loved it. I got chills when I heard that because he did not mince his words. He immediately came in and set the expectations for how he wanted to have a culture within his administration. And so leaders, employees want to know that you're committed to this work, but it's one thing to say it, but words are not enough, which leads me to my second point. You have to be intentional. Simply saying diversity and inclusion are important without putting in the work, it's performative at best. And your employees want to understand your intentions and they want to see you put it into action. So they want to see you get involved. One way you can get involved is with the employee resource groups that exist within the organizations. That might be how you actually find the next leader within your company, right? So pay attention to who's doing the work in the ERGs and think about like, man, they may be a really high performer. How do we get them moving up the ladder? And it's important to not penalize and not allow other managers to penalize their employees for participating in these kinds of activities like employee resource groups. Instead, value these opportunities as the career development opportunities that they actually are. And so when your ERGs have events, show up, spread the word, be a champion for them, right? And then in terms of also being intentional, I love where the conversation was going on the last session, where they said, right, say what you mean, say what you're trying to do, say Black. Again, like I love it, right? Let's get comfortable saying it, say Black, not just underrepresented minorities, not just people of color. If you want to make a change in representation for your Black employees, say it and do that. And so put a plan into place in terms of how you're going to make that change and then actually do it and be accountable. So that's my last, point in terms of leaders. Be accountable, communicate what's happening, because if your employees can't see it, then they don't believe it. They're just going to assume that nothing is actually happening, right? So if you do something well, celebrate it. Celebrate those wins, even if they seem small. And if you fall short, if you just mess up, say it, speak about it, right? Acknowledge if you've made a mistake, and then provide information on how you're actually going to course correct in the future. You also need to use both qualitative and quantitative data in order to actually understand what's going on in your organization. So in terms of being accountable, you'll put metrics into place so that you can actually track this progress. Because we know companies have managed to hire Black employees, and oftentimes we see them come in at entry-level roles. But there's a drop-off as you get into manager and VP and SVP level roles. So we need to identify what is actually happening. Why are people leaving? Well, we don't want that. We need to retain that talent. So you need to understand exactly what's going on, those key issues within your organization that are contributing to that gap. And you need to understand the unique experiences of your employees. What are they going through? Do you have leaders who are mistreating people? And then lastly, leaders, fix the inequitable practices and policies that got us here in the first place. Look at how bias interrupts things within your organization. This is your opportunity to make a change. So I talked a lot about the leaders. I want to talk to you all who are managers, especially middle managers, people who are new, maybe people managers. You have an opportunity as well to make a major impact within your company. And it starts with leading inclusively. So oftentimes when people think about diversity, they go right to the idea of recruiting. But if you're actually creating an inclusive team where people want to stay, it's one of the most significant ways that you can actually retain your Black professionals in your organization. And I always like to share this this quote with people, because there's this survey, there's this research from the Kapoor Center. And I came across this quote and it absolutely broke my heart. So someone says, I was treated as an other, excluded and undervalued in my office. I was sat in the back, I was ignored, and it was made apparent that I was a diversity hire. I was told I was too sensitive, and I was told that the other Black and lesbian folks in the office didn't feel as I did after mentioning homophobic and racist jokes being spewed in work-only chat channels. So I left my employer because I was being treated unfairly as a Black woman and as a human being. I mean, just broke my heart. No one should ever feel this kind of exclusion within their company. But we know that actually unfairness-based turnover is a $16 billion a year problem, especially within tech and tech specifically. And so companies have a real opportunity when they are thinking about creating inclusive cultures to be able to retain their talent. So I'm going to hit on these next couple of points pretty quickly because I know I'm coming up on time. So you want to make sure that you are also developing your talent. So when I think about development, who are you tapping on the shoulder for those shiny projects so that they are able to get visibility to leadership, like I talked about earlier in my own experience? Because we know that it is so important for people to get that visibility in order to kind of keep rising up. And so we also want to focus on, really using sponsorship as a way to help develop. So if you're a leader and you can sponsor someone who's coming up behind you, do it. There's this study that I was just reading the other day, and basically, Black employees compared to white employees had a significant, showing in terms of saying that they don't feel like they have that access because they're not getting visibility to leaders, and especially when it came to Black women. They especially felt that they were not getting that access, and it was having a real impact in organizations. So as I mentioned, both my CTO and my CMO were both sponsors for me in my career, and sponsorship accelerates career advancement because they are more likely to have these opportunities to grow and advance. And when I say advance in some situations, I'm not just saying just a title, but in some situations, it's moving laterally into other business opportunities within an organization. And so through sponsorship, through that visibility, you start to actually understand what other opportunities exist. And so sponsorship is so different than mentorship because mentorship really just focuses on giving people kind of advice here and there. Again, this is about really speaking someone's name when they are not in the room, being their champion and saying like, yes, this person would be awesome for that role. They would be so great because here's what they bring. They have all of these different skills and experiences that would be valuable even in a different position. The last thing here is to beware of bias. And I wish that I had hours on end to talk about bias, but I'll simply say to learn about bias, go to the unconscious bias trainings, read up on it, because there's so many different types of bias, and it can honestly creep in at every different aspect of everything from the hiring process to referral programs to even how people give feedback within the performance review process. So if you're a manager, be aware of your bias and so that you can combat that every single day. And then lastly, I want to talk to my individual contributors. And the last 2 points that I'll give, they really do go hand in hand. The first one is be a recruiter. And you're probably like, that is not my job. That is not what I'm here for. But when I think about being a recruiter, when I first took the job at Tableau, they had it in the job description, actually. It said something like, everybody at Tableau is a recruiter and you're going to help us find the best talent. And I was like, that's weird. That I don't get what you're kind of saying. But then I actually sat with it for a real minute and thought like, okay, actually that does make sense. You're representing your organization. And so you should also be helping them bring in talent, share open positions with your networks, tell them about these roles, get them in here. And be a champion, especially if you're in tech, be visible. Go out and talk to people about the type of career opportunities that exist here. And I had to share this quote because I absolutely am so excited about our vice president. But her mother, would say to her that you may be the first to do many things, but make sure you're not the last. So I think about this for even our individual contributors. You have an opportunity to reach back as you do climb and bring other people into the fold. So there's so many opportunities. If your organization is going and recruiting at HBCUs or whatever it is, if you have an opportunity to volunteer to go and represent your organization, do it because representation matters. I want to see people who look like me working at those booths. I'm way more likely to go and have a conversation with them and want to work at their organization because I saw somebody who looked like me. So I know I have outlined a ton of different things that, everybody can do at least at a high level. And my hope is that you'll at least commit to starting to think about these things. Think about your sphere of influence and what you can do. And if you're one of those people who you're like, actually, I love everything about this, I want to work in diversity, equity, and inclusion, please do, check me out, andreagtatum.com. I do basically career development and coaching with professionals who are thinking about moving into a full-time career in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so with that, I'm going to pause because we've hit right at the end of coming up on time. And so I just want to thank you all so much for all of this, that you all have given me this opportunity to be with you all today.
Awesome. Thank you so much. This has been fantastic. And we really appreciate you sharing your expertise with us. I was hoping that you could share a little bit about some of the resources, because you come into this work. I loved when you shared your story at your event about how you weren't planning to start a business in terms of the work that you do from a DEI career standpoint. So if there's someone here that's interested in a DEI career, if you haven't seen the influx of DEI related roles, I don't know where you've been over the last, like,
Right.
even now, like if you just go on LinkedIn and you search diversity, equity, and inclusion, you'll see so many roles. Talk to us a little bit about how you help to support professionals that want to make that transition. They don't feel like they've got HR experience or they've never been in that seat before. Similar to a little bit about what Ashley shared. She shared a tinge about her experience, but talk about what you do in that space.
Yeah, absolutely. So, when I think about this work, a lot of times people think about DEI and again, they just say, oh, okay, well, chief diversity officer, but that's like one of many roles within the diversity space. And so you want to think about actually how do your skills and your experience translate into something that can actually be really beneficial to an organization. So that's what I work with people on, and thinking about how do you take your experience. A lot of people I'm working with right now come from an education background. They were a teacher of some sort. And so they want to get into D&I facilitation. And there's a really great translation there because you're educating people on what to do. And so we think about that, finding the right opportunity for you. Not everybody has to be the CDO. They need employee resource group managers. You need HR business partners. We need people to do all of these different types of roles. And depending on the organization, that's the other thing. I kind of help them figure out like what's the right type of company to work for, because that will actually impact what you're able to do and how successful you'll be in that type of role. So I just work with people to really dissect all of those skills and what they're passionate about and what do they love about the work inside of diversity, equity, and inclusion, so that they can be a part of this really interesting career path.
Thank you for sharing that. And just one follow up. So, if there is someone here who may be interested in a DEI career, what advice would you share in terms of how to position yourself for those kinds of opportunities?
Yeah, I always tell people, take the opportunity to learn, educate yourself, educate yourself, educate yourself. That does not necessarily mean go and spend thousands of dollars on, a certificate. I have lots of thoughts on that. If you can do it and can afford it, great. But that's not the only way into this work. I think your last panel was saying that, right? Like you got Google, you got, and there's so many different companies, even the company I work for, Catalyst, we have tons and tons of research specifically that talks about diversity and inclusion and how to do it. So the more you can be knowledgeable about this space, the better. And then that way you're able to go in and have these conversations when you're interviewing and understand what's actually happening within a company. So that is my number one thing, is take the time, read a ton of books. I heard you mention earlier Minda Hart's books. It's one of my favorites. It's sitting up here on my shelf under all my Barbies. So I just highly recommend find those education opportunities and find community, learn from leaders on LinkedIn and see what they're talking about, and then find the right position.
Awesome. Well, you all heard it here. Thank you so much, Andrea, for being a part of this. This has been fantastic, a great way to almost wrap up the day because we have one more closing session that you don't want to miss. So I'm really, really excited. See us over in our final session. We will get started right away. And we so appreciate you all being with us today. Thank you again, and we'll see you in just a couple of minutes.